next week, of course, an enormous amount on the agenda for Keir Starmer in that meeting with Donald Trump. Let's talk about all of it. So David Manning, former British ambassador to the US between 2003 and 2007, joins us. He's a director at Gatehouse Advisory Partners. A very good morning to you, Sir David. Thanks for joining us. It's interesting, just before we kind of get to what's on the agenda for Keir Starmer next week, sum up for us how you're taking all of the rhetoric towards Russia and Ukraine from the US in the last week. Has it gone from a little worrying to terribly worrying? Do you think it's just rhetoric and it's all negotiation tactics? How do you frame it?
I think it's gone from a little worrying to very worrying. People before the election were saying that they weren't sure that Trump would actually engage with Putin in this way and that some of it was just election rhetoric. Now we know that he means it. He's going to have a summit with Putin. He's brought him in out of the cold. He has effectively last night blamed the Ukrainians for being invaded and said it's all their fault, so it's blame the victim syndrome. So I think it's very worrying for America's Western partners.
What do we think about the sort of breadth of this US view towards Russia and towards Ukraine? I mean, Marco Rubio is a very interesting case in point. He was a traditional Republican hawk, really, across lots of issues. Hawkish on China, hawkish on Russia. How can that just sort of evaporate towards one country in particular and still exist towards another?
Well, we don't know that it has evaporated entirely. I thought it was interesting, that one shouldn't perhaps read too much into it, that he was saying before his talks with Lavrov that he wanted to see if talks were even possible. That's a different emphasis, anyway, from the message that was coming out of Washington simultaneously, which was taking it for granted that talks would go ahead. I think we have to see how comfortable Marco Rubio is in this role. And I think we also have to see how far there are strains and stresses within Trump's own administration about the foreign policies he's following. At the moment, we have an administration which is obviously dominated by one man, and I suspect his ministers probably are sometimes as surprised as we are by what he says and does. But I think it's too early to be sure how a Rubio-led negotiation will be conducted.
How important is Keir Starmer's trip to see President Trump next week? Do you think he can change his mind on key topics or not?
I think visits to the US by the British Prime Minister are always important. They're certainly important for us in Britain. At the moment, we believe that there's a good relationship. It's obviously very early days. But I see it myself as an opportunity for reconnaissance, if you like, to find out how this new administration is settling down and how far what Trump has said he actually intends to do, how that will impact on us in Britain, whether it's our security interests or our economic and financial interests. Are we going to be hit with tariffs? But also much more widely, is this going to be an administration that we can work with on the basis of shared assumptions, shared values, not identical policies, but certainly policies that are congruent? Or are we in a new world where this is going to be very difficult to do?
I mean, the Prime Minister has an enormous responsibility with this trip, doesn't he? He's the first European leader to go and meet Donald Trump in the White House. To try and rebalance how these peace negotiations might go a little bit more in Ukraine in Europe's favour, that's on him, isn't it?
Well, I think he will certainly want to do that. I doubt whether he sees himself as carrying this burden for Europe, in quotes. Just to come back to your point, you know, Mrs. Meloni in Italy has her own relationship with Donald Trump, and other European leaders will too. And the incoming German Chancellor will want to establish a relationship. And we can't speak for Europe. What we can do is, I think, try to talk to our European partners in working out how to deal with this new situation in which Europe is not at the table at the moment for this negotiation that has begun between Russia and the United States, and try to see whether or not it's possible to persuade Trump and his administration that we should be at the table and that we have real agency as well. There's a slight tendency at the moment to assume the only two people involved in this negotiation are the Russians and the Americans. And certainly that's the sort of mood music in Washington. I think it's important to remember the Europeans have a stake in this, an important stake. A lot of the frozen Russian assets are in Europe. The Ukrainians themselves certainly have a stake. They fought for 3 years for their independence in the face of this unprovoked neo-imperialist aggression. And I think there's also the question about what goes on in Washington. Will the Congress itself acquiesce in this apparent abandonment of the principles which America has upheld since the Second World War?
In terms of the extent to which Trump can be convinced, do you think there is a difference in any president in terms of how malleable they might be in their second term versus their first term, and in particular for Donald Trump?
I think the general feeling in a second term would be that you're dealing with someone you know. They're usually consecutive. So this is a different situation. Trump has been out of office for 4 years and has come back. He strikes me as being in a great hurry. He knows that he's got 4 years, but at the midterm elections, which are 2 years away, he may or may not retain control of Congress. At the moment, narrowly, he does. So I think this is a president who is 78. He's in a hurry. He wants to do all the things he thought he might like to have done first time round and failed to do. And I think he sees himself as somebody who can bestride the stage and get deals done. The question is, what's in those deals?
Just a quick snapshot, because you mentioned it, mentioning the new German chancellor that we'll have fairly soon. How important are those German elections?
I think they're critical for Europe. I think if you look at what's happening in Europe this year, the need to have strong, coherent leadership from Berlin at a time when so much is focused on European security and at a time when President Macron is in the doldrums is very important. Britain is not in Brussels. It can talk to its partners, but we need a strong leader.
So, David, forgive me for interrupting. Lavrov has just started addressing the issue in Ukraine. Let's listen to that.
To the meeting of the ministers of foreign affairs with the state secretary, where discussions on state security would be taking place. First of all, as we said yesterday, we first of all need to remove any threats to Russia which were created by trying to drag Ukraine into NATO, and also we need to stop actions of Kiev regime which are aimed at killing everything that has got to do with Russia, so religion, Russian culture, economic ties and so on. So the tasks that were set by the presidents are large-scale tasks, and we will continue our endeavors to implement those tasks. And we'll take all measures in order to adapt as quickly as possible to the changing environment, and we'll engage all reserves of our ministry. And we see that we've created a new department, second department, diplomatic department for Africa. We will continue to expand our ties there. Also in Asia and Latin America, we have 3 new embassies, and we are planning to add 7 more embassies.
So, David, obviously we caught a little bit of what he was saying about Ukraine there before moving on to talking about Africa. He said part of the discussions with Marco Rubio was about removing any threats to Russia, he then said, which were created by trying to drag Ukraine into NATO. What do you make of that?
Well, this is standard Russian propaganda. Nobody tried to drag Ukraine into NATO. The reason Ukraine wanted to go into NATO and continues to want to go into NATO is because of the Russian threat. We need to go back to 2014, when Putin launched an unprovoked invasion of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, and has consistently been trying to nibble away at Ukraine territory ever since. The response to that, of course, was the Ukrainians who, at that point, were not particularly keen to join NATO. They were keen to join the European Union, but not particularly enthusiastic about NATO. They've become very enthusiastic because of the Russian threat.
One thing that we heard Lavrov say yesterday when he was wrapping up his meeting was that no forces, whether they're officially NATO forces, or they come under a different flag or banner, EU forces or an EU member country's forces, should be allowed in Ukraine. If that's part of the peace deal, I mean, what are its implications? Do you think that is looking likely at this point?
Well, I think it's much too soon to discuss, who may not be involved on the ground if there's a peace deal. We haven't even got to a ceasefire yet, so I think, it's a long way off. But no, I don't think it's acceptable at all. Again, it is compromising the sovereignty of Ukraine. Ukrainians ought to be given a deal that they can accept, which guarantees their security. The reason Lavrov and Putin don't want Western forces of any kind in Ukraine is so that Ukraine is easier to bully.
In terms of what the message might be of all of this to China, is it possible to be tough on one country and less tough on the other? What's the message, do you think, to China over the last couple of years?
Well, I think it's a very interesting dynamic, this. What conclusion will the Chinese draw if the United States gives up on defending the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a partner whom it's been supporting for 3 years? What does that mean? Is that a signal, well, we don't care about Taiwan? You want to take Taiwan, you take Taiwan. You want to bully the Philippines, you bully the Philippines. We don't care. We'll carve the world up between us. So I think there's an issue here about exactly what message the Chinese take from this. But to your point, Wilf, what is the message that the Western partners of the United States will take from this? If the United States is seen to be an unreliable partner, they are much more likely to decide to compromise with China and make accommodations with China. And that's not necessarily going to be in America's interests.
Mm-hmm. We're still monitoring Lavrov, obviously, and we will continue to bring you any highlights, particularly as it relates to Ukraine. So, David, the other question I have is just about the rhetoric we've heard in the last couple of days about an economic relationship in particular that the US might want to build with Russia. I mean, is it, if we fast forward 10 years, fair to say that deeper economic ties are a good thing for peace? I mean, we heard about that over Europe in the post-World War II era. Is there something behind that, or is that wishful thinking?
I don't think it's wishful thinking that you want good economic ties and you want to promote trade. I think that's absolutely the case. One of the things that's interesting about the confrontation at the moment, if we can put it like that, between China and the United States, is that their economies are deeply intertwined. That wasn't true in the Cold War. We had very, very limited economic ties with Russia. Now, in theory, if you have close economic ties, it ought to be a way of escaping, if you like, the confrontational relationship. One can only say it doesn't always work out like that. And just because you've got close economic ties, I'm afraid, doesn't mean necessarily you won't have a bad and difficult political relationship.
Mari's joined us on set as well. And Mari, we were talking with Sir David about this trip to Washington next week for Keir Starmer. Do you think he'll see it as representing the interests of Europe? Would he try and frame it that way, or is he going to kind of try and keep a low profile in case it doesn't go his way?
I think to an extent he will see it as an opportunity to do that, to be able to really provide leadership on behalf of Europe, not instead of, but I think to an extent he will want to show that he's the first European leader going over to meet Donald Trump in Washington, and therefore that allows him to kind of throw a little bit of weight around, let's say. We've got Macron holding another summit today with other European leaders and Canada, for instance. So we know that the French also want to be in that leadership role. And I think to an extent it's an opportunity for Starmer to actually be able to have the ear of Donald Trump and perhaps try and allow him to understand a little bit deeper why Europe is so concerned and what the priorities for Europe are. Donald Trump is often talked about as, learning on the job. He learns by listening, and therefore conversations with him can actually be quite pivotal.
So, David, what sort of skill set is required from a Prime Minister travelling to meet President Trump in this particular moment in time?